Couple things. One, this is my final exam. Two, say hello to Van Gogh. This is my own copy. Three, yes, I did not make my bed. Sue me. Four, every time I say something that I think is good, I'm going to take a bite of this donut. Obviously, there's already a bite out of it. It means that this is not my first try. Let's begin. So I'm going to be evaluating two views today on immortality. I'm going to be comparing them, contrasting them, and I'm actually going to try to synchronize them together towards the end. Now, the two views that I'm talking about are the West Coast Soul narrative. This would be the chapter in Cave's book on Dante, and it's going to be the physical resurrection narrative. This would be the chapter titled Paul and the Cannibals. I'm going to talk about each view first. I'm going to try to not acknowledge a ton of questions and problems with them, and then that's it first. So I'll just talk about the view. Then after that, I'll describe the problems with each view and how they solve them, and then I'll try to compare and contrast them. What's better than one? What's better than the other? And I'm actually, instead of picking one or the other, I'm going to bring them together and try to say that they both come together and really fill out a Christian understanding of the afterlife and of the resurrection. So let's begin. First view I'm going to talk about is a physical resurrection. Why is this ideal? Well, because you don't have to have any other ontological commitments beyond the physical, beyond those properties that can emerge that aren't ontologically distinct. So with that kind of view, we can say, actually, this is me. This is me. Now, you might not be able, depending on your view of mind, you don't have to hold to a strict physicalism regarding mental states, but you can. And so you have a lot of wiggle room there. As long as you don't go into a Cartesian dualism, then you're fine. And the first reason why, as I said, this is really appealing is because there are no ontological commitments, which is a huge problem regarding immortality. Secondly, though, it really takes seriously the role that our human bodies, our physical nature, play in developing deeper, our self, developing our consciousness, developing our psychology. Now, we talk a lot in this class about psychology and uploading consciousness and those kinds of things, but the fact of the matter is we have no examples of any kind of consciousness, any kind of being, any kind of self that is maintained outside of the body. And so what this view does is really acknowledges that and holds to it. One more thing is more of a theological commitment, is with this view, this really brings to task the belief that all of creation is being redeemed. So, and unlike some unhealthy Neoplatonic understanding of the body and soul, or even like Gnostic, that would be better, Gnostic understanding of the body being evil and the soul being good, this view actually naturally affirms the goodness of the body, which I think is really good, and I also think that's a good point, so I'm taking a bite of a donut. Let's go to the West Coast. So, on the other side of this thing, we have the West Coast approach. Now, the way I'm going to be using the word soul here is not in the Cartesian sense. I think that's problematic. Instead, I'm going to understand the soul as that thing that emerges from the mind, from the brain. Emerges from the brain, not the mind. Emerges from the brain, and then has causal power into the material world, and then has diachronic outplaying throughout my own life. Now, I'm going to hold to a Mysterianism position where I don't necessarily know exactly how that happens, but that emergence that comes out seems to make most sense of that reality. Now, again, there's not necessarily any ontological commitments here, which is good, and this actually would render a lot of Cave's argument problematic because he really goes after a strict form of Cartesian dualism. But beyond this general understanding, some benefits of this view are as follows. There's no problems with the continuity of your psychology, of your consciousness, because, well, the thing that yourself is this thing that has emerged, and God can take that thing and continue it after you die. And so there's no break. God will just keep it up there and keep it following. The example that you shared in class, which is Hasker's example, is when you have a magnet that's holding something up and you pull the magnet away, it still holds up there for a second before it falls. Similarly, God could be doing that kind of thing. So it really does a good job with continuity. Secondly, or this is actually thirdly now, so I explained a basic thing, I gave one thing that's benefit. Now here's a second benefit of this view. It seems to coincide with a lot of the traditional Christian doctrines of kind of a mystical inner self. Now, this is a little bit loose. I don't want to, I'm not being super precise here kind of intentionally, but there is tons of talk of a soul throughout Scripture, and it seems like in those cases they're talking about this kind of inmost being kind of thing. And I think that description, that general description, fits really nicely with this understanding of one's soul, this kind of deepest self. And so, while this isn't a huge issue for me, I think it is convenient that this kind of teaching coincides with this kind of view. So that's another reason why. And I'm going to take another bite of the donut. So, let's talk about some problems. On the material side, you can say, well, what do you do with the break in consciousness? Which is a serious problem. Because on a more strict understanding of the view, when I die, my parts go into the ground, and I have to wait to be recapitulated. So one could say that God holds my own psychology in God's mind, but that seems really loose philosophically, and it seems problematic because if I am my body, and my body is deteriorated, I am no more. So even if God could rebuild me, there's a huge, and even if God could rebuild me, there's a huge break in the chronological outplaying of my consciousness, which is really, really problematic. That's the biggest problem over here. Similarly, one problem about this over here, about the material world, is it actually doesn't take into account a lot of the modern physics that we have. Right now, of course, is my influence from Chad. But when you look at the smallest particles of yourself, there is no material, there's energy. And so the question becomes, well, what do you even mean by material? That's a smaller qualm, it's kind of broader and more metaphysical. It's a small theological qualm, and it's more broad and metaphysical, but it's still a question. Thirdly, the question of the cannibals. What do we do with that? So if I'm my body and my body is eaten, what do I do? Those are all three good questions. The cannibals and the metaphysical qualm and the question of continuity, I think, can all be answered if you hold a view of materialism that says that the brain, that you are a couple essential parts in your brain that give rise to a self that is not ontologically distinct. We're not talking dualism here, but has different properties that emerges from there. So you can still be committed to a kind of physicalism and acknowledge that things come out of that. So maybe like a property dualism, or even some more liberal forms of non-reductive physicalism. So by doing that, I can just say, well, the cannibals, if I get eaten, those parts of me will just kind of go through that person's system, and then God will take those parts and they would go through the person's system and they wouldn't be digested, so they'd not become a part of another person. But also, when I die, God would take those parts and hold them up in heaven, and after making some copies or whatever, leaving them in my body, and God would maintain those parts until there's ready time for a resurrection. This would be a kind of a play off of Van and Wagen's understanding. And there's another philosopher from seminary on the East Coast who also talked about this, whose name is escaping me. On the other side, with the soul narrative, one problem is the question of the possibility of a Mysterianism, and the questions that you don't really make a lot of claims ontologically about it. So you say that the soul does this and it does this, but what is the thing? And you just kind of have to rely and say this is a complex system and we don't quite know. That's a problem, not insurmountable, but it's a problem. Secondly, this is the more important problem. If we are our bodies, if a body is essential to one's identity, how can you have a psychology? How can you have a soul that is distinct from it, that is still in existence when your body is not? See, and this is where I'm going to take the two views and bring them together. As you probably noticed, there's some overlap. So the way that I would understand is there is this other concept, this abstract soul type thing that emerges from some material qualities and some neurons in the brain or wherever. And so when we die, I believe that God would make replicas of those little neurons or whatever and then take them with God into heaven, which are material things, but they give rise to consciousness, right? So now I have continuity in terms of psychology, moral, narrative, everything else, continuity. There's still a commitment to the physical, and I don't have to deal with as many of the problematic questions of ontology, of the mind, of this thing, of the soul or whatever, because I'm still committing to a material ontology. Now, of course, there are questions there, but I feel like that mitigates some of the questions. If I just made no ontological claims whatsoever, that's kind of problematic, but now I'm making some claims that back it up. Lastly, this view, I think, really, really beautifully reconciles the theological question of the waiting period. So, when we go to heaven, everything is not right. We are not yet resurrected in our new bodies. And if we said if we have our new bodies up in heaven, that's just not true. We have not yet been resurrected on earth. And so what this view does is it commits to a few essential parts that are taken that give rise to a soul, but they haven't been fully resurrected yet. And so by bringing these two views together, you create a comprehensive understanding of the soul and mortality that really, I think, works. So I'm going to take a couple more bites of my donut. I know I'm over, but because I'm chewing on my donut, you don't have to watch this. You're just doing this for fun now. So, cheers. I really debated going on for like another 5 minutes, but I decided you're so busy you have to do everything. So that's my understanding of everything. I did go over, but most of the time I was eating donuts, so you can't fault me for that. If you have any other questions for me, just let me know. Thanks.